Good afternoon. I wanted to make a few additions to last week's waterways. The river that I talked about that starts in Northern California and goes into Oregon, and the river that was repaired by two people named Brown. One was Jerry Brown, our governor, and the other is a lady who was governor of Oregon. And together they came to make a decision, and they took down the 7 dams on the Klamath River, the Klamath. And so that now the salmon can make it up the river to spawn and back down the river to go to sea, to grow big and fat and come back and end up in your frying pan. That's the Klamath River. The other that I was talking about, which is actually the beginning of the Sacramento River, is near Mount Shasta. And the lake that's there, this huge lake, is called Lake Shasta. And if you go up the coast, but not along the coast, but along Interstate 5, all the way to Seattle, you will see a number of these geographic features. There will be Mount Shasta, which is snow-capped all year round, and the source of much water, for Lake Shasta, which is the source of the water that flows down the Sacramento River. And right above Mount Shasta is something that we all heard about because it blew its stack. That's Mount St. Helens. And then you keep going like that all the way up until you get to the tallest mountain in North America, Mount McKinley. So we have these various features to our landscape, and much of them are a source of water, particularly when it's snow melt that comes down and then goes through a river system or forms a big lake, and then the lake becomes part of a river system. And that is Shasta and Mount Shasta. And then the last thing I didn't mention was that because we do so much work on the Bay, Corps of Engineers working and dredging and working its way up the American Sacramento River that has been put together by nature, then you get to a place where you have dredged deep enough so that Stockton, the city of Stockton, has now become an ocean-going port. That means very large vessels, mainly freighters, can come up to Stockton, because at Stockton, you're tapping the Great Sacramento Valley. And the Sacramento Valley is, of course, a breadbasket for much of North America and for exports of food to Asia. So you have Stockton as an ocean-going port. You have Lake Shasta and Mount Shasta. And all those were not mentioned by me because I can't remember everything when I go to search my memory bank. Tonight this afternoon, we're going to talk about French-American relations. I assume you know that France is our oldest ally and continues to be today, with President Macron making very friendly gestures towards President that he even tolerated Trump, but he is much happier with Biden. And he's, though, giving Biden a challenge, but we'll get to that in a minute. Let us start with the very beginning. When we were a colonial people and we decided as 13 colonies, we did not want to be part of the British Empire. And so we have an American Revolution. We have people like Patrick Henry saying down there in Virginia and Richmond, and very famous church, "Give me liberty or give me death." And so it was liberty that he got, and it's what we wanted. Now, in the process, not that they liked us one way or the other, but the French nation had just suffered a defeat, and the winner was Britain, and Britain had taken away from France Canada. French Canada became a British colonial possession. So the French wanted to get even. And the way to do that was to be nice to these American rebels. And so those rebels came over to France. There was Benjamin Franklin from Philadelphia. There was Thomas Jefferson from Monticello in Charlottesville. And there were those famous New England types, Abigail Adams and her husband, John Adams. And so it was that these Americans pleaded with the French to help them. They needed help. And the French were sympathetic, particularly the French foreign minister, who was Versailles. And he was determined to pay Britain back and make her lose her North American colonies. And so it was that the struggle began. Now, how do we have evidence that the French really did anything more than talk, which they're very good at? Well, we know that very early in the struggle, a young French nobleman actually saved his own life by avoiding the guillotine. He became a great American supporter, and he came to America and met George Washington. And he was like Washington's adopted son. Washington had been in love with a woman who married his best friend. And so for a while he was not married, and then he married Martha Custis, who became Martha Washington, and she had already had her children. And so Washington had no children of his own. And he sort of took up the young Marquis de Lafayette as his adopted son and had him go along with him when he became commander-in-chief of the American forces, which were a motley group at best. And so first off, you have this French nobleman working with us, and then you have these Americans in Paris trying to sell the French on support. And once they began to see that we could at least keep an army in the field, they began to give us support. The French sent us supplies. Most of the muskets we used were French. The French sent us an army, 10,000 soldiers. The French sent us French gold. You had to pay for things. The army that they sent us was commanded by Rochambeau, a French general. And to show you that these things were important, towards the end of the war, when things were finally going badly for the British, more than for us, even though they were going bad enough for us, Washington didn't win any battles. All he did was run away from battles, but he kept the force alive. He kept the forces at Valley Forge fed, and they lived through a terrible winter there in Pennsylvania, which is going on in Pennsylvania to the very day. They're having big snowstorms back in the east. We even got some snow here on the area around Tahoe in the Sierra Nevada, which is good for us because that's water for us this coming summer. So Washington is making his way and trying to stay active in the war, betrayed by Benedict Arnold, but still working to get a success. And he finally is going to get that success when a very arrogant British general brings his army, which he's put down in the deeper South, and he's now bringing that army up from this deep South into, now the deep South are just South Carolina and Georgia. Don't think of Alabama, Mississippi, they don't exist. But down in Charleston, he has brought a force in. He's got some very ugly people with him. Tarleton started a campaign in South Carolina, and he called it Tarleton's Revenge. He didn't take prisoners. He just killed people. And so the Southerners, who became aggravated by this process, then called for Tarleton's Revenge, and they didn't take prisoners. So here's everybody killing everybody and nobody taking prisoners. Not a good sign. So this man, whose name is Cornwallis, comes up through North Carolina into Virginia, chasing Thomas Jefferson out of Richmond. And then he comes down the Virginia Peninsula, very famous area, and he goes between the two great rivers there, the James River, the most southern of the Virginia rivers, and the York River. James River named for King James I, and the York River for the Duke of York. And both of these are deep flowing rivers now because they've gone beyond the fall line, coming down to the Chesapeake. Why is Cornwallis going in that direction? Well, he hopes to be relieved by a force that will come down from New York City by warships that will come in the Chesapeake and save him. So he gets down to Yorktown and he finds that he has to build a redoubt system there to protect his front. And in the rear, he has himself pushed up against the York River. And what happens, of course, is a strange combination of features. The French are now seeing that we are going to win and the British are going to lose, and they're delighted. So from Brest on the French Atlantic coast and from Toulon on the French Mediterranean coast, two fleets leave to come to North America. And one of them gets first into the Chesapeake Bay, finds themselves going up to the mouth of the York River, and then hears from Washington that he and Rochambeau and all the rest with Lafayette have come down and are facing Cornwallis, who's up against the York River. So he's pleading to get support, particularly heavy naval guns, and have them fire from the riverside, that is the York River. And so sure enough, the French fleet comes up the York River and docks and anchors itself behind the British who are on the hills there. And so suddenly you're going to have a battle in which there's no hope for Cornwallis, and Cornwallis loses, surrenders, marches out to the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," turns over his arms, and therefore it's over. That is, the Americans have suddenly won the American Revolution with lots of French help. And this is 1781. And in 1783, we go to Paris to sign the Treaty of Paris, which gives us 13 little colonies, our independence. And it's done with a great deal of French help and French flair. And years later, maybe say 30 years later, the young Lafayette, who's still alive, makes a visit back to the United States and makes a grand tour of the area that was now the expanding America, because Jefferson has become president after Washington and Adams, and the nation is growing, and now this Marquis de Lafayette is an older marquis, but he's still alive, and he's there making a tour of this new and growing United States. And so that's our first and very important engagement with the French. And it continues, not always happy times. In the case, let me give you a case called Cinco de Mayo, because we're going to see a film soon with Shirley MacLaine and Clint Eastwood, in which there's this thing being mentioned of some French soldiers down in Mexico. And they're down there because now Napoleon III has set himself on the French throne for the Second Empire. And in that case, he has supported a group of two. Basically, it's his wife, Carlotta, and the Austrian Habsburg, Maximilian. And he's put them on a false throne that he sort of invented, so that now French influence will be very strong in Mexico. Well, the Lincoln administration, who's now in power, is very busy with something called the American Civil War, but they've let it known to the French that we do not appreciate the French intervention in Mexico, and we will make that known once, of course, the war is over. Well, in the same time, the Mexicans didn't want either the French or us or anybody back. And so we celebrate Cinco de Mayo, some of us do, because it is a big, big holiday in Mexico, when in fact the French, Carlotta and Maximilian, with them get thrown out. And now the Mexicans are finished with intervention by foreigners, particularly Europeans who are unwanted, to include Americans who are also not wanted. So we had this little intervention there, but no big break between French and American relations. And in fact, the relationship continues as a very valuable one. And come World War I, which is 1914 for the Europeans, but always being late for war, it's 1917 for us Americans. But when the Americans arrived, all the channel ports were taken up with the British Expeditionary Force, so there's no room for us on the channel. So we landed in France at places like Brest on the French Atlantic, and that's one of the places where the French fleet came to save us. And apparently those young soldiers were rather well educated compared to what we get today in the regular student, because when they landed in Brest, their greeting was, "Lafayette, we have returned." So now these Americans in 1917 are coming to the rescue of France, which is having a very hard time in this horrible war that was a meat grinder taking thousands of casualties. We weren't very smart in the war. Number one, we didn't have any of the right equipment. We had to borrow French airplanes, British airplanes. We had to, when tanks came out, we had to borrow tanks. What we did was we were very stupid, and we brought a lot of horses with us. You can imagine what good horses were against machine guns. So horses finally were out. Anyway, we won that war with a lot of other people doing a lot of other work and a lot of other dying. And so the war came to a close. And there was a famous armistice that was signed. It was signed in a railroad car in a forested area north of Paris at Compiègne. And later in World War II, when France was overrun, Hitler came to that railroad car and had it burnt down to its rail trailings. And when the war was over, the French came back and rebuilt the railroad car exactly as it had been before, and made a big ceremony about having that railroad car as an example of the defeat of the Germans in World War I. But life went on. There was a long period of the 20s, generally known as the Jazz Age. A lot of Americans stayed in Paris after World War I, particularly two famous writers, Ernest Hemingway, who coined the word the lost generation, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And both have great books about this period, none of which have ever been made into a decent film, although have been tried over and over again. And so World War I comes to a crash in a financial way, with people jumping out of windows on Wall Street. It was the Great Depression, which was dramatic in Germany. Germany had already suffered terribly in World War I, unbeknownst to us until we had to go help the Germans. The Hoover Commission, named for Herbert Hoover, had to come over and help feed them. Food was short. Their shipping line, German Lloyd line, had been destroyed by the British Navy. And so the Germans were in a very hard place. And with that comes the rise of that horrible man Adolf Hitler. Not initially, and initially he fails in his attempts. But finally, given the terrible situation in Germany with the Great Depression hitting them very, very hard, it's one of those tragedies of German history that actually Adolf Hitler was freely elected Chancellor of Germany. It is true that his thugs roughed up some of the population, but nevertheless, he won the popular vote, just like someone I can talk about and don't want to, who won this ancient thing called the Electoral College recently in our country. And so Hitler is coming to power, and you have the rise of his forces, and you have World War II. Again, the Americans are going to be very late to that war. In fact, we only get into it by accident. The accident, of course, is called Pearl Harbor. The Japanese imperial forces decide, against the best advice of the best man they had in their military, Admiral Yamamoto, who told them, do not strike America. It's like a sleeping giant. I've been there. I've lived with them. And if you wake them up, it will be to your great harm. And they woke us up by bombing our fleet at Pearl Harbor. And it was to their great harm. It's called Nagasaki and Hiroshima and the fall of the Japanese Empire. But in that process, France was, in this case, occupied and overrun. And there was no one coming to her rescue. It was all that the British could do was to hold on themselves. So it was that France fell, and by the compromise that was drawn up by Marshal Pétain, the north of France with Paris became occupied France, and the south of France, which is south of the spa city of Vichy, became Vichy France, allied, of course, with Hitler's Germany. Now there we are again. And what's our relationship with France now? Well, first off, as several people like General MacArthur pointed out, we were at war with Japan. They were the ones who struck us at Pearl. We have nothing to do with the European war. But as a gratuity, that idiot in Berlin, he himself declared war on the United States. He was in a partnership with Japan and Italy, not that it mattered very much. They didn't do anything to help each other. A little with Mussolini, nothing with Tojo. So it was what to do. Here we have Berlin declaring war on us, which was exactly what Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had wanted, because he, with Churchill in the Atlantic Charter, had decided that they would support each other. And of course, Roosevelt, how to put this, could have been impeached. What did he do that was impeachable? Well, not only did he agree to send and exchange a huge number of destroyers for bases in Bermuda, but then he had the rest of the American Navy go up to Halifax. This is Canadian waters, where these great convoys were assembling, and then the convoys would try and make it across the Atlantic with the supplies. And waiting for them, of course, was Grand Admiral Donitz's submarine forces, the Das Boats of the world. And so what did Roosevelt do? He instructed the American Navy to do something that was illegal. They were to go out with the convoy and search for these U-boats. And when they found them, to hover over them. You know, the U-boat is underwater by, let's say, 50 feet, very slow moving underwater, and trying to avoid us because they hear us above them, and they hear us using a machine that was invented at Cambridge and Oxford and St. Andrews. And those are the British universities that came into the war to support Britain. And they developed what we call sonar and the British call ASDIC. That is, they could ping downward through the water and find the submarine. So there's an American warship sitting on top of this German U-boat and going, come over here, you British destroyer, and bomb the hell out of this place, and you'll get them. And so the British destroyer comes over and then sends down a lot of munitions that make it very uncomfortable for the U-boat, particularly if it makes the U-boat explode, and all the flotsam comes to the top, and you see either the dead submariners or maybe some live ones who are getting out of a sinking sub. This was an act of war in anybody's book. And Roosevelt did it anyway. To hell with the Congress. Let them make the most of it. And so it was that we were again in a war. This war was a two-ocean war. We had to fight in the Pacific with our American Caesar bothering everybody. That's General MacArthur. And two admirals also, that's Halsey and Nimitz. And then on the other side of the world, we have a war that'll have to go through General Eisenhower, because sooner or later, Eisenhower will have to take charge of a very large American force. And that very large American force, to make this go a little faster, is going to finally do something that is astronomical. Even though we know that Herr Hitler has taken and guessed right that we will make a landing somewhere on the French coast, and that we've promised this to Herr Stalin, who is absolutely furious that we haven't done anything to help him, who is now an American ally. And Stalin is bleeding to death. It's Stalingrad and other places. Now, what to do? Well, Stalin at Yalta, at the famous conference before Yalta, even in Tehran at that conference, has demanded from Roosevelt that he open a second front. And so Roosevelt has promised to do so when he gets back to Washington. It was very hard for this crippled man to do. You know, our president had come down with polio when he was vacationing in the 20s up on the Canadian coast, the Atlantic Canadian coast. And now he's basically crippled and in a wheelchair, and it's very painful. And so it is that he's trying to make the promises that will keep Stalin in the war, giving him lots of lend-lease, doing everything he can. But Stalin wants American fighting men somewhere on the western side of Europe, mainly in France. And certainly the French want him. So it is that we get ready for the landings in Normandy. Now, during all this time, as I say, Pétain had signed an agreement with Nazi Germany, ceding the north of France as occupied by the German army. The commanding general in charge of all of northern France was von Rundstedt, getting my vons wrong. Von Rundstedt, commanding, there's a special German word for it I can't think of. Anyway, he's the commanding general of the West. And now we're going to have to do something about it. So Roosevelt does appoint this guy from out west of German heritage, by the way. Eisenhower is not an Irish name. And Ike is going to come to London to set up his headquarters there. Now, we move to another person who is a real pain in the rear, but is a French patriot of the First Water. His name is Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle was in World War I. Now he's back in World War II. He's the leader of the Free French, and they have taken themselves off the beaches where they were surrounded by the Germans, and they had gone across the channel to England. And he was in charge of the Free French who were in England, in London. And he made everyone was very sure who he was. And he made a famous statement: France has lost a battle, not the war. So he stayed, was a tremendous thorn in the side of Eisenhower, with an enormous thorn in the side of Churchill, making sure they all knew that there were Frenchmen in Britain waiting to go back across the Channel. And that time came. We did this tremendous thing that people didn't think was doable. We had all kinds of troubles. There was Eisenhower, supposedly with a girlfriend. You got these guys in London, and my, what happens? He turned his headquarters in London into an American citadel. And so instead of calling it what it was, they called it Eisenhower Plots, meaning Eisenhower and all these Americans were getting ready to go to Germany, and they were cluttering up this elegant part. It was Mayfair, no less, of London with all their claptrap. But they got ready. And de Gaulle got ready. And then we all together with every government in exile. Do you realize that in World War II, all the governments that could ran away when they found themselves defeated? The Dutch Queen, Juliana, was in London as a government in exile. The Norwegian king was in London, government in exile. On and on. The only king that didn't come over was the Danish king. He stayed in Denmark. But to show that he was proud of his Danish citizens who were Jewish in many cases, when the Hitlerite forces that were and had run over both Norway, which had been sold out by Quisling, and it just walked right through Denmark. When they demanded that all Danish Jews wear on their sleeve a yellow Star of David, the Danish king, who went out every day riding in this wonderful, wonderful park, the Tivoli, went out that day riding, wearing a very, very large Star of David on his right shoulder, letting the Danish people know that while they were occupied, they should do nothing to cooperate. This was a very important sign because the most famous Danish scientist in the world was still in Copenhagen, and he was a nuclear physicist. And the Anglo-Americans were afraid he'd fall into the hands of the Germans who might be working on a nuclear bomb. There's a very famous Broadway play, a London play also, called Copenhagen, about this scientist and the problems he had trying to avoid being taken prisoner and forced to work on a nuclear bomb. Nevertheless, things began to get closer to the day of the comeuppance. And so it was that we, under the orders of General Eisenhower, prepared for the landings in Normandy. And then Eisenhower, often away with his, how to put this, in World War II, every male in England that could was in the war. So women were used as drivers for trucks, military trucks like a quarter ton. Quarter ton is what you call a Jeep, a 3/4 ton, even a deuce and a half. They were the drivers. And so Eisenhower was assigned a very beautiful young woman as his driver. And it's fairly well known that He had an affair with this woman. The word got back to Washington, and the senior general advising FDR and his right-hand man was General Catlett Marshall. And George Catlett Marshall was a no funny business kind of guy. He'd already told Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, you may call me General Marshall, and I'll call you President Roosevelt. That was to stop FDR from calling Marshall George, which FDR liked to do. But Marshall wanted everything on a business level. And now Marshall sent out a very famous telegram to all flag officers, we call them, generals and above. It simply said, this is to let you know that no officer will be allowed to get a divorce during the war. The message was very clear to who it was aimed, and no one made a move. If you were a general like the one who was in North Africa, you were a bachelor, you could then have a very famous affair with a very famous, notorious German woman. Her name was Marlene Dietrich. And Frau, or Fräulein if you prefer, Dietrich was very democratic. She lived with us. And so she decided she would sleep with the privates, 18-year-old privates, and 22-year-old sergeants, and 2-star generals, share the wealth. She'd also land with us in the southern landings in France, singing to our troops a very famous German song, Lily Marlene. But let us get back to Eisenhower. Eisenhower decides there will be 5 beaches, Canadian beaches. Of course, American beaches. Our 2 most famous are Utah and Omaha. And there will be shared beaches by the Allies who will come in also to help us at Normandy. And then the shock of all shocks comes to Eisenhower. He hears that the British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, plans to land at Normandy with the first landing craft. Now, a lot of people are going to die on the beaches. A lot of the landing craft are going to fail. People are going to drown. And the last thing Eisenhower wants is to have to come and land and save Winston Churchill, this sort of fat, roly-poly bulldog of a British leader. So he picks up the phone and calls Buckingham Palace. It's not easy to call the palace. They don't have a system where somebody answers. But finally, one of the people who work there answered the phone. And Eisenhower said, I'd like to speak to the king. Well, not everybody can speak to the king. But he said, I'd like to speak to the king, and I'm Dwight David Eisenhower, commanding general of all Allied forces in Britain and elsewhere. So the king came to the phone. And Eisenhower said, sir, you've got to do something. You've simply got to do something. Churchill is planning to land in Normandy with the first wave, and that cannot happen. He will endanger us and himself. You must order him not to go. The king said, I understand, and it will be done. And there was a famous phone call made from Buckingham Palace to number 10 Downing Street, asking to speak to the British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill. And the king made it perfectly clear that he could not spare Churchill a single minute, let alone a day, a half a day, not a single minute. And he was not, absolutely not, to go and land at Normandy in any way. Is that understood? And Churchill said yes. But other people did land. It was a rather funny thing. It was the landing took place. Lots of people died. The landings were successful. They swooped inland. They headed towards Paris. Now we're back again with that big, strange, difficult Frenchman, Charles de Gaulle. He has landed at Normandy, as a French division of the Free French has landed in Normandy. And Eisenhower gives in and lets the Free French, under General Leclerc and the Second French Division, speed ahead and take Paris. And no one tells de Gaulle what to do. And so de Gaulle went with the forces that went into Paris. They came into Paris when it was still an active war zone. Bullets were flying. Didn't bother de Gaulle at all. He walked straight down the Champs-Élysées, straight to the Arc de Triomphe. Hitler had planned to blow up Paris. He had ordered Brent Parisa, and he wanted to know on the phone to von Rundstedt, is Paris burning? It's a famous book. The answer is no. The munitions were set, but French underground people learned where they were and disconnected them. So there was no blowing up of the Place de Vendôme, of the Rue de Rivoli, of all the things on the Champs-Élysées, of the Louvre itself. No, no, no. He was not to have his way. He was not to destroy. And so it was that de Gaulle was back. De Gaulle was in charge. De Gaulle set the orders. He became the president of Free France. It didn't last very long. The French were not in a mood to celebrate, excuse me. So it was that de Gaulle's government fell and another government came, but we were there in the France of the day. And so were two rather strange people. They had come in right behind the French Second Division, and they had gone over to liberate the bar at the Ritz Hotel. Ritz Hotel is very famous in Paris. And who were these strange Americans? Well, one was Ernest Hemingway, and the other was an American Southerner from Virginia, the Virginia First Families, and he was a rather famous guy, and they went in and ordered drinks. So odd people got involved in the liberation of the city. Others had fled for their own good. It turned out that during the war, Coco Chanel, the very famous designer, had taken as her lover had taken as her lover the German naval attaché in Paris. And she knew that things would not look good for her once the city was liberated. So she disembarked from Paris in a hell of a hurry and made her way to Switzerland and did not come back until tempers had settled and she was not in danger. She had a very good friend in Winston Churchill, because Winston had used her during his effort to save the king. This was the king that was so stupid that he gave up his entire throne and all possessions for the woman he loved, this dreadful woman he made, the Duchess And he did abdicate his throne, and his mother never spoke to him for the rest of her life. And he had nowhere to go. They gave him a fortune in London and told him to get out of town. They had taken him initially to American waters, where he was to sit on an island and stay put, because all they didn't need was for him to be captured by the Germans and sent to Germany, where he'd already been, to say nice things to Herr Hitler in Berchtesgaden. So it's a very confusing picture. Just let us say the Americans were back in France. We were delighted. They were delighted. Things went on. But de Gaulle was still there. And in the remaining period that I have to go with you, I'm going to go into de Gaulle. He came back to power in a very famous way and became president of France because he rewrote the Constitution. It's the Constitution they have today. They've had 5 constitutions. We've only had 1. They've had 5. They're now the Cinq République. And in that case, he wrote a constitution where there was a very strong presidency, and that was him. Then he also just decided that he wasn't going to be subservient to anyone. He didn't want NATO headquarters any longer in France. So he kicked us out of Versailles, and we had to flee to Belgium to set up NATO, which is still located in Belgium. He did not dislike the Americans, but he wanted to be made perfectly clear that he was in charge and that France was independent. He then made sure that the German question would be solved. The Germans had been an enemy of France in 1870 and 1914 and again in 1939. He called on the new chancellor, the old man, d'Alter, Konrad Adenauer. They met at a very famous church that the Germans had damaged very badly, church at Reims. They both were Catholic. They went to Mass together and set up a famous rapprochement. And they sealed that by going to the Mass and having a very friendly chat and deciding that France and Germany would be allies now forever, which was something we wanted, but we had no hand in doing it. It was de Gaulle's hand. De Gaulle then decided to make nice with us, since he'd kicked us out of Paris, out of Versailles. So he invited a strange guy who had a Massachusetts accent, didn't seem to really know how to speak good English. That guy, of course, was John Fitzgerald Kennedy and his French-speaking wife, Jacqueline de Beauvoir Kennedy, later Onassis. And so they came to Paris on a state visit. And Kennedy made a very famous speech. He simply said, "I'm the man who brought Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris." And that was the case, because then Jacqueline Kennedy spoke in perfect Vassar French to a big gathering of French notables. And now it was time to return the invitation. So de Gaulle came in all his glory to Washington, D.C. Now, his government had already figured out what Jack Kennedy's weakness was. His weakness, of course, was always women. Never not enough of women. Not just Marilyn Monroe, but all kinds of women, women. Jack has actually been married before, and his father had arranged the divorce. They had their own special cardinal up in Boston, Cardinal Cushing, who tried to always keep the Kennedys out of trouble. Didn't help Ted much with Chappaquiddick. That girl drowned. So it was that you have Le Grand Charles de Gaulle at the White House for this big state visit, not a little visit, a big visit. And you have him sitting next to Jacqueline Kennedy. And in her best Vassar French, she says, Mon Général, you know, my grandfather was French. And without missing a beat in his best English, de Gaulle said, interesting, so was mine. And so it was hard to outflank the great general. And he brought with him a little duo. It was her first transatlantic trip. She came on her own airplane. In Italy, she's known as La Gioconda. To the rest of the world, she's known as the Mona Lisa. And she usually was in a very special place in the Louvre with around 8 other Leonardos. You know that Leonardo left Italy, left Tuscany, left Florence to go to France with King Francis I, who invited him and gave Leonardo a wonderful chateau in the chateau country of the Loire River. And so it was that he gave a lot of his paintings. He brought Mona Lisa wrapped up in this, tied to the side of his donkey as he crossed the Alps going into France. And so it was that the French inherited when Leonardo died, and recently gave a huge exhibit for the big anniversary of Leonardo da Vinci, and he gave it in Paris at the Louvre, not in Florence, because they own more Leonardos than anyone else in the world. And now she had come to visit the Americans in our, what we call the National Museum. We have this terrible habit of trying to name everything national. The National Airport over on the Virginia side of the Potomac, now been renamed for Reagan. And we have this National Museum, which should have been named for the man who gave most of the money to build the museum, Mellon. But it wasn't. And she was there for 6 months. The people in the Louvre were furious. They didn't think she should have traveled. They thought it was endangering the very old oil painting. But what de Gaulle said happened. And I was living in Washington in those days, and it was wonderful. The line went all around. You didn't have to storm the Capitol as they did recently. Your line went up to the Capitol and back again. It was of art lovers, not of terrorists and people trying to destroy the Capitol. It was wonderful. And so he did that in recognition of the relationship that goes back to Lafayette, the French-American relationship. And there she was in all her glory, not in the Louvre, but at the national, better known to me as the Mellon Gallery. And for those 6 months, you couldn't get anywhere near the museum. People waited out front for hours just to get in to take a look, a peek. And so de Gaulle went back to France, having made amends. He supported us strategically by saying that's what allies do in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He also came back to Washington himself for Kennedy's funeral, saying that's what allies do. Now, he has since gone away, of course. He lasted 10 years. Then there was, surely you must remember, the 60s. Well, the 60s were not just at Berkeley, although people in Berkeley think that's the only place that mattered. The 60s were all over the world, and the 60s were very, very difficult time in Paris, in France itself. And so it was that the students and the workers in their uprising, de Gaulle had to step down, and he did, and went off into exile. And when he died, everybody came to his funeral, to include President Nixon. So it was that French-American relations, bouncy as they have been from the days of our revolution, from borrowing 2 fleets, from the destruction of Cornwallis, all the way from the bad days of Cinco de Mayo, when we have the French pushing an Austrian onto a throne he's not welcome on, all the way to World War I and World War II, all the way through Kennedy, and finally to de Gaulle's funeral. De Gaulle was a very open-minded man. I'll tell you a story. It's a place I used to stay in Moscow. It's very huge with very tiny bedrooms. It's built for when they have these big meetings of the Comintern, when all the communists are bringing themselves back to Moscow. And so I stayed there once, and it's very cheap. And I also enjoyed very much staying there because it was right off Red Square, and you could see Lenin's tomb and St. Basil's Cathedral. It was all quite wonderful. And I was there in a snowstorm. So here I was in Moscow in a snowstorm in a very big complex run by the Communist Party. Now at nighttime, around 9 o'clock, the phone would ring and you'd pick it up thinking, maybe someone important's calling me. No, it's just the front desk. And the front desk is asking, would you like a nice warm blanket? Because it's cold, it's snowing. And if you were wise, you said, no, no, thank you. Because the big warm blanket was a very tall, slinky Siberian blonde who was furnished by the house. And you didn't want to get tangled up with that because you'd never get out of town. We had a couple of Marines who got in trouble that way at our embassy. One was sleeping with a slinky blonde and went to jail. Now, there was a Frenchman who was I think, number 2 man in the French embassy. And he was smart. He stayed at the National Hotel, which is a wonderful hotel right across from the Kremlin. And there were cameras in the head posts, in the foot posts, in the walls, in the ceilings, everywhere in the room there was a camera. And he invited this very slinky Siberian blonde to spend the night. And a week later, a Russian member of the KGB asked him to dinner. And he went to dinner, and the KGB officer, the KGB is the Soviet version of the CIA, Commissariat for State Security. And he pushed a folder across, and the Frenchman opened it, and lo and behold, here are pictures of him in his birthday suit. And the Siberian blonde is in her birthday suit. And they're both doing all these gymnastic things that he didn't think he could do. And he was just amazed. And he looked through and he said, my God, I'm wonderful. I look wonderful in these photos. Is there any way I can get a set? Because I'd like to take them home with me and, share them with. And he was serious. That's the French for you. And to show you it's not just the French at one level. A year or so later, there was a great reception at the Élysée Palace, and de Gaulle was still in power. And the Frenchman involved in the gymnastics came through the line and saluted General de Gaulle. And de Gaulle looked at him in a quizzical way and said, I understand you have been busy in bed. Not you're fired. You disgraced us. Get out of the country, leave us. Just, I understand you've been busy in bed. So it was that you could find different attitudes towards things in different ways. But the relationship with America remains still strong. It's strong today. The new Secretary of State for Biden spent 8 years in France, and the French know it. He attended a French école, a French high school. He is not only bilingual, he is fluent in French. And the French are counting on that as a connection, as they always have. Back to the old days, once they knew Jack Kennedy well, and the British had assigned as their ambassador a British guy who'd gone to school with Kennedy when Kennedy was in England with his father, who was our ambassador before World War II. And so it was that the French knew also of Kennedy's particular big attraction to other women. And so they sent an ambassador to Washington who was married to a very famous woman. Her name was Nicole d'Alphand. And she gave wonderful parties, and she had the best chef, and had modeled before for a great house in France, Pierre Cardin's a culture house, haute couture. And so it was that you had this woman who was very good at dancing with people like Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. And I remember once seeing Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense. And he was in his office when I came by, and he was trying to do something that everyone did in those days. He had a hula hoop, and he was shaking his rear end to keep the hula hoop from falling down to his feet. And I said, well, what's going on, Mr. Secretary? And he said, well, I've gotten an invitation to the French ambassadors for dinner, and afterwards they always have dancing. And it's to kill to get an invitation there. You just would do anything. And so I've got mine and I'm going. But I understand that Mrs. d'Alphand is going to have us all learn a new dance tonight. And the dance is something Chubby Chuckers does. I think it's called the twist. And you have to learn how to shake your rear end, and you practice with a hula hoop. So I'm practicing. What do you want? So here we were in the Vietnam War, which de Gaulle warned us not to get involved in. He'd been involved in it and lost. Here was de Gaulle, who had ended this whole mess of colonialism. He said, I'm going to get out of Algeria. It's not worth it. We have lots of wonderful Algerians working here and have worked here. Rosa is an Algerian, Berber Algerian. Anis, who was here, and any number of other people who came over and became American citizens and worked here at Piedmont Gardens. And it's wonderful. But, de Gaulle was fed up with it, fed up with the Algerians. They wanted their independence. Give it to them, damn it. Give it to them and give it to everybody. I'm going to free the entire French Africa. And he did. Everybody in Africa who was French in the French colonial sense was given their independence. Get out, get out, get out wherever you are. And if you want to, you can join the franc zone. And it will be very helpful to you if you join the French franc zone, because that will allow you to trade equally within the common market. And everybody wants to trade in the common market. So all Morocco had to do, all Senegal had to do, all the Côte d'Ivoire had to do was, you are free, get out, join the French Union, Then by being part of that union, it's nothing but a money association. You will be able to trade equally to everybody else who's trading within the common market. And de Gaulle made that a demand on the common market, and they did nothing but give up and say, yes, they can do this. So it was a good deal for everybody. And de Gaulle was finished with these colonial wars. They were wastes of time, and the colonies didn't pay for themselves anyway. And we want out of that. We want to make money. And today, what do you get from France? You get fast trains. The TGV is the best train in the world. I've ridden on it many, many times. It goes at 220 miles an hour and zips down all over France, and now zips into Germany, and now zipping to Vienna. And it zips up to the coast, where then you go across the channel, and where those dumb British have not been able to put together a train system that works. You have these fast trains. You have the fabulous fast airplanes. What do you think the Airbus is? And where is it located? In France. Where? At Grenoble. Good Lord, it's not at Grenoble either. It's down in Toulouse. And you have fashion, French fashion, which is still the great fashion houses of the world. Where do you hear the words Coco Chanel, Christian Dior, Pierre Cardin, Balenciaga? In Paris, in Paris, in Paris. And so it is that on the back of Jacqueline Kennedy, she was almost going to bankrupt Jack Kennedy while she was always buying clothes in Paris. He wanted to know why she couldn't buy clothes in Hyannisport. So it was that our collection of friendships, the things that we love and know about France. I mean, who is it but George Gershwin, who writes American in Paris? Who is it but Cole Porter, who constantly writes about French things and puts words to music? The great Greta Garbo made a film called Ninotchka. So great film set in Paris. Cole Porter turned that into a musical, Silk Stockings. Over and over again, the connective links, the connective links, the connective links to a great civilization, one different than ours, one that has been friends to us from the very, very beginning, one that understands us probably better than we understand ourselves. And lucky we are to have them. And now we have a man who's very interesting. He was president of France, married to an older woman. Some Frenchmen believe older women are the best women. She used to be a teacher of his. I'm not recommending marrying Berkeley professor teachers, but females, that is. And he wants to be an equal partner of ours. He wants NATO to build itself up, and not to be subservient to the Americans, but an equal partner in the defense of the values of the West. And I say, hooray to you. And he knows he has a connection because the new Secretary of State for Biden is a man who speaks perfect French and has gone to a French high school for 6 to 7 years. And so it is, the connection remains strong over and over and over again. I've gone way over time. Shame on me. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.